Alright, welcome back. In this video, we're going to go ahead and talk about some of the options in mentalRay. Now, there's so many options, and it can get so crazy that this can overwhelm a beginner, and it really intimidates people who are new to mentalRay and rendering using the mentalRay render engine. So let's go ahead and talk about some of these options. Well, let's go over here to regions, and we're just going to access these options from here. And we'll just go to active viewport options. And what we'll get is this PPG window that pops up, and we have two different subset of options like we talked about before. We have the render region options, which I'm going to collapse to get out of the way. I don't want to talk about those right now. And then we have the mentalRay render options, which are all these options down here. Now, I'm going to move this window all the way to the top right there. There's a reason for that. You're going to find out in a moment why that is. And we'll see we have all these options here. But these are only about 5% of the options in mentalRay. We have more options over here in this tab. Then we have another tab and another tab and another tab. We have another tab. Oh, this one's not so bad, right? Only one option. Let's go ahead and click that. Oh, that's a lot of options. Oh, this one ain't so bad either. Just two options. Oh, man, more options. Oh, there's even more right there. And then we have diagnostics, and then we have MI archives. So as you can see, we have quite a number of tabs, and each tab opens up a window to more options, and some options open up more options. So as you can see, you can clearly see why this would be very daunting and intimidating for a beginner to mentalRay. So what I'm going to do is try to take some of that fear out of the beginners and go ahead and explain and give you a rough overview of what these different tabs do and some of the more important options in those tabs. All the options are important in reality, but there's some that you can go ahead and get a gist of and understand now, while some you won't understand until you see them in action. So let's start off with the first tab, which is the rendering tab right here, and we have quite a few options. I'm not going to talk about all the options, but I'm going to talk about some of the most common options that a beginner can go ahead and start using right off the bat. And I'll explain them, and first I'll give a really quick explanation of what they are mentalRay wise, and then I'll give a nice quick simple explanation in layman's terms so that you can go ahead and understand it better. Okay, we're not going to talk about primary rays because that's not going to make sense to you right now. Let's skip on over to aliasing, and then we see it says ray tracing and scanline only. What is this min and what is this max level? Well, these different sliders control the quality of the render. The general rule of thumb is that the lower the number, in other words, once you get into the negative numbers like -3, the lower the quality, but the faster the render speed. The higher the numbers, if you go up to 3, the slower the render is going to be, but of course you're going to get higher quality renders with none of those little jagged edges and things like that, and no artifacting. So why are there two sliders? Why isn't there just one? Well, there's a reason that there's two, and for those of you who want to know the term, it's called adaptive sampling. Of course, it doesn't make any sense to a beginner, so we're not going to talk about adaptive sampling. What I will say is that the min level controls the minimum amount of anti-aliasing that can be performed by the mentalRay renderer. What is anti-aliasing and what does it perform? Don't worry about that right now. All you really need to worry about is that it affects the quality. The less anti-aliasing you have, the less quality you're going to have. But the faster your renders, the more anti-aliasing, all the way up here to level 3, means the higher quality, but you're going to have much slower renders. So it's a little trade-off that you're going to have to figure out between performance and quality. So it's really up to you. Now when you're in the preview mode and you're checking stuff out and you're not ready to do a final render yet, it's good to use low settings. I personally like to use something around -2 to -1. Actually -2 is a little bit better, and 0 for the max level when you're doing previews and you're testing stuff out and you're really trying to get stuff done quick and out the door without having to worry about quality too much. So the max level is going to tell mentalRay, look, never do more than an anti-aliasing level of 0 and never do less than -2. If you put both of them at the same number, which I don't recommend because it defeats the purpose of adaptive sampling, it's going to go ahead and tell mentalRay, look, do everything at level 0. Never do more than that and never do less. So why is that bad, and why does that defeat the purpose of adaptive sampling? Well, to explain that, I'd have to go ahead and explain what adaptive sampling is and show you a big old complicated chart of adaptive sampling and what's happening under the hood of mentalRay, which we're not going to get into right now because honestly, it's going to be a waste of your time and it's just going to confuse you more, which is going to be counterproductive. So, always remember that when you're going for a high level render, put this to about 1 and 3, usually works pretty good. And if you're going for previews, I recommend going at 0 and -2. So we're not going to talk about any of these other options, and we're not going to talk about the sampling contrast threshold here. And leave it at the default. The default is fine. When you're going for higher quality renders and you got this up to 3 and 1, I recommend that you change the contrast here from 0.2 to either 0.1 on all the channels, or even better, 0.05 on all the channels. But of course, this is scene specific. What do I mean by that? It means that every scene is going to be different. So some scenes will render out better and faster at 0.2 and some won't. So you just got to kind of play around with the numbers. And once you get experience with mentalRay, you really start to understand and know how to set up all these numbers. Let's move over to optimization. Optimization, we have a lot of different options here. We have our binary space partitioning tree settings. Not going to talk about that right now because it's not going to make any sense at all to you. What I will talk about is this render type setting up here that says full render. That's the default. You can see I have 4 different render modes I could choose: light maps, final gathering, photon maps. Of course, you're probably thinking, what in the world is final gathering? Photon maps? What is that? Sounds like some kind of special laser gun from a sci-fi movie. Well, it's not. We'll talk about that later. Full render just tells mentalRay to go ahead and render a nice beauty pass. Render out with all the nice colors and the lighting and the shadows and everything. Let's move over to motion blur. Motion blur, for those of you who don't know, is the effect of motion blur, which is that effect that you get in some movies and things when you see something moving really fast. Think back to the old Wild Coyote and the Roadrunner cartoons. But whenever you'd see the Roadrunner move around, because he was so fast, he would leave this motion blur effect, this kind of motion blur trail behind him whenever he would move, because he was so fast. Motion blur is a special effect in mentalRay that allows you to create those types of motion blur effects with your movies or your rendered, well, yeah, you can do that with rendered stills too, and whatever it is you're doing. So it's a pretty neat effect to add in. It adds a little bit of realism, gives renders a little bit of extra kick. Then you have frame buffer. You're probably thinking, frame buffer, what in the world is that? That's such a weird name, frame buffer. What does that mean? Well, I'm not going to go over what the frame buffer is or what it means, because it won't make any sense to you at this point in time if you're a beginner into mentalRay, so don't worry about it for now. The only thing I'll talk about is the sampling filter up here, which is right now set to Gauss, which is Gaussian. If we open up that drop down box, we'll see we have 5 different filters we can use: box, triangle, Gaussian, Mitchell, and Lankos. So what are these filters? Well, these filters affect the quality of the final render. Now, box is the lowest quality filter. I recommend that when you're doing preview renders. And Lankos and Mitchell are the highest quality filters and take the longest to render. Now, in my experience, using Mitchell, for example, isn't going to increase rendering time by a lot. So it's not going to hurt your performance too much if you use Mitchell or Gaussian or Lankos. So I strongly recommend you stick with Gaussian, and if not that, switch over to Mitchell. Now, each filter works differently depending on the filter size of the filter itself. Now, the recommended settings is, if you're using a box filter, use a filter size of 1. If you're using triangle, use a filter size of 2, Gaussian 3. Mitchell and Lankos are good at 4. You never really have to go higher than 4 with these different settings here. So I'll leave it at Gaussian and 3, which was the default. That's perfectly fine. I'm not going to talk about jittering. I'm not going to talk about the color clipping or any of that stuff. So let's go ahead and skip that. Let's go to shadows over here. Shadows have very few options. What it does, it enables and disables shadows for different things. You can enable shadow maps, and you can enable shadow maps for motion blur. You can also change the different types of ray trace shadows. So you can choose, you can disable them, you can enable them, you can just sort it and segment it. Now we're not going to get into what any of that means right now. We're just going to go ahead and move on for now. Now we have final gathering. And when it's disabled, you don't get any options here to keep the PPG a little bit cleaner and more organized. When you check it on, it opens up all the options for final gathering. So you're probably wondering, final gathering? What is that? It sounds like some strange gathering of some weird club that worships some weird person or something. Final gathering is an algorithm, one of two algorithms that mentalRay uses to figure out indirect illumination. What is indirect illumination? Well, we can have a whole discussion on that, but we're not going to get into that can of worms right now. What I will say is that indirect illumination is a way of imitating the way that real-life lighting works in the real world. And we'll get into that later in a whole video where we're going to talk about just final gathering, and in another one where we're going to talk about just GI and caustics. So these are two algorithms for finding out, for having mentalRay calculate indirect illumination. So we're not going to go over final gathering right now. We're going to spend a whole video talking just about that. And we're not going to go over GI and caustics. GI, which is short for global illumination. We're going to turn that off and turn off caustics. We're going to get into that again. A whole video in this tutorial is going to talk about just that. And that's actually going to be the most interesting and funnest video to do and for you to watch, because we're going to do some very neat things and have some fun with mentalRay and those. Then we have diagnostics. mentalRay has diagnostics tools. The same way that there's diagnostics tools for people in a hospital to check you out and see what's wrong with you if there's anything wrong with you. mentalRay has diagnostic tools that allow you to check out why you're getting errors, why things aren't rendering, why things are rendering wrong if they are. We can also use diagnostics tools to check out the progress of rendering and check out different information in rendering and things like that. We can also view our BSP tree interactively, but we're not going to talk about that now. Let's skip on over to MI archives. I'm not going to talk too much about this because this is really outside of the scope of this tutorial, but I'll explain to you real quick what it is. mentalRay isn't just the renderer in XSI. mentalRay also has a version available out there called mentalRay Standalone, which you can purchase from Mental Images. It doesn't come with XSI, so don't bother looking for it. You don't have it unless you bought it separately, and in that case you would have it. The mentalRay Standalone renderer is a standalone application that allows you to render mentalRay scenes without the use of XSI. What you can do in XSI, however, is export your current scene in the mentalRay Standalone format using these tools and options here. Then you can take those scenes and files into the mentalRay Standalone if you have it and render that out. In this case, we're not going to be using mentalRay Standalone because that's another program, and we're not going to get into that. I mean, we've got our hands full with just learning to use mentalRay and XSI. So that's a very brief overview, very quick to the point overview of these options for mentalRay. So let's close this PPG. I'm going to end this video now, let all that stuff soak in, watch the video one more time if you have to. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and move on with our little project here and start to use mentalRay in a more practical manner. So I'll see you then.